Who can we trust? Our elders? Well, mine taught me to believe in Santa Claus. Can we trust our churches? Well, besides Santa, one church taught us that the sun goes around the earth. And they didn't just teach us that, they really resisted and punished alternate teachings or alternate explorations. How about doctors? Can we trust them? Well, they taught us that scurvy was incurable and that smoking was safe. How about the media? They did not warn us about economic instabilities and maturing trends. How about politicians? How about trusting them? Can we trust them? Right, as if our politicians are more trustworthy than politicians in general. Beware of trusting tradition. Traditions come and go. Respect them, but do not worship them. Copernicus and Galileo both noted that the Earth revolves around the sun, but only Galileo attracted the wrath of the ruling empire of organized coercion by proudly challenging tradition, even after having been warned. Nearly 2,000 years before them, Aristarchus, Seleucus, and even Archimedes had also publicly referenced the idea that the Earth revolved around the sun, though Archimedes simply acknowledged the model while rejecting it as false. So it's one thing to merely reference something like Archimedes did, or like the Roman Catholic Church did in condemning the heliocentric model. And it's another thing to confirm it or explore it or apply it or condone it. And further, it's yet another thing to openly disrespect tradition by advocating a model contrary to popular trends, popular superstitions, popular beliefs, and even publicizing the error of egomaniacal dictators. Galileo was emphatically warned that aggressively publicizing his model of an Earth that revolves around the sun would result in personal punishment, and then he openly risked that punishment, resulting in his conviction as a heretic by the Inquisition. He was spared the typical death sentence of ritual human sacrifice of the Holy Roman Empire's Inquisition, and was even spared imprisonment, instead only being placed under house arrest for the rest of his life, which was 9 years. Now, there are many popular beliefs which may be myths, from Santa Claus to geocentric models of astronomy to political intolerance, like the theatrical anti-communist purges headed by U.S. Senator Joe McCarthy. Ironically, that anti-communist purge was rather similar to any other purge, including communist purges. The McCarthy purge was rather like it would be to organize a counter-inquisition to purge all Catholics as punishment for the historic Inquisition by a few Catholics centuries before. That McCarthy purge is somewhat of a replication of the thing it was alleged to oppose or prevent, a mere hijacking of the prior tradition, a clear hypocrisy. Now, some people shout and scream and rage each time that a politician is exposed as a hypocrite. Eventually, one may notice a pattern. A high proportion of the politicians in world history, in every country, and every time, have condemned behavior patterns that they were practicing themselves at the time, especially deception, but also coercion. But why condemn spies for practicing deception? Why condemn assassins for practicing violence or terrorism? Why condemn commercial advertising propagandists for cultivating distraction, disinformation, and confusion? Why condemn? Well, cultivating distraction, disinformation, and confusion is the clear function of mainstream media and education. At least influencing behavior, if we want to just dilute it on down to influencing behavior based on the interests of the organizers of that program or indoctrination or training. The clear function of mainstream media and education is to produce particular behaviors and behavior patterns and so forth in the participants within that system. And that system is organized by certain groups, typically that are in power in some way, like the federal government influences public education policy throughout the entire United States. So if that uh, program of instruction tends to encourage people to have positive uh, presumptions about the federal government, that would be predictable. Why wouldn't a federally funded program be uh, promoting the interests and the uh, respect toward, even worship of, the federal government? That's predictable. So what would actually be really odd would be frequent disclaimers in mainstream media or public education warning the masses that commercials or classes are designed to influence perception and behavior. Of course they are. So have we been trained to condemn certain practices primarily in order to discourage us from practicing them, like for the monopolizing of those practices by certain parties? Or have we at least been trained to condemn certain practices to discourage us from openly practicing them? Historically, there have been many social institutions that have cultivated antagonism against their own institution and then punished the rebellion. My favorite fictional example of this is in the book 1984 by George Orwell. Courts need crimes and criminals. Armies need enemies, like in the U.S. Civil War, in which the Union Army invaded and occupied the people living in territories that wished to basically get a divorce from the USA. At least that's what was represented by the leaders of the South, of the rebel states, that the people in those territories, all of them, or some important minority or majority or whatever, wish to secede from the U.S. However, could any individual or group in the governments of those southern states legitimately speak for all of the people of those territories? That reminds me of how the U.S. military, when they'd go around uh, dealing with the Native American indigenous people, they would recognize leaders of the Native American tribes that would agree to comply with their interests, and then the U.S. military would record that person as the chief who had authority to sign the treaty. They would sell the land and agree to move all the people off. And once that chief did that, that was the chief that the U.S. military recognized as the legitimate chief. Why? Because that's the guy or girl, but generally guy, who fit the interests of the U.S. military. So the U.S. military would have like elections where they would have people, Native American people, mark a ballot in order to receive some benefit, like a blanket, perhaps laced with smallpox, but nevertheless, or whatever it was that they would give as a benefit, they would require people to mark a sheet of paper. And it was a sheet of paper in which there was a single candidate listed, or a single, you know, uh, single item ballot, and everybody would vote in the particular way, and then the U.S. would uh, clear the people out. So I was just kind of generally considering that basic idea that any individual or group might legitimately claim, or might claim that they're the legitimate authority over an entire group of people. And that's actually a little bit unusual. Um, it's not a lot unusual, but it is a little bit unusual. So, and back to the example of the U.S. Civil War, several people within the southern rebel states said our entire state is seceding from the U.S. Uh, federal system or network or union, Um, and while several leaders of the rebel Confederacy may have favored secession, which sectors of the population favored or opposed secession in the South, in those states? Isn't it obvious that there was a variety of political opinions and preferences throughout the Southern populations? How about amongst Native Americans who lived within those territories? Oddly enough, various groups of Native Americans and even slaves may have fought on both sides of the U.S. Civil War. So some people may say that the sacred principles of property rights were being defended by the Confederate soldiers. The legal right to own another human being as property. And many of the moral justification ideologies or moral ideological justifications of politicians that are popular within a particular group at some time are later relaxed or even reversed. Even the Roman Catholic Church officially reversed its position on Galileo's heliocentric model in 1992, which was 359 years after his trial, conviction, and sentencing for the crime of heresy. And the heresy, again, it wasn't specifically for calculating the model, it was for publicizing it. And doing so in a way that, was contrary to the interests of the ruling institution of organized coercion. So the government of the U.S. has also famously reversed several positions, like on the issues of slavery, the right of women to vote, and the criminalization of alcohol. In fact, what was once a crime punishable by death or life imprisonment, speaking of the Navajo language, was later a famous secret weapon of the U.S. military in World War II. And about 200 years after the religious freedom, at least of certain white males, was protected in the U.S., the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 was passed. Yes, even protecting religious practices that included the use of the Navajo language, which previously was, a very serious crime. So traditions come and go. Respect them, but do not worship them. Or at least beware of worshiping them, and even beware of trusting them. Jesus apparently taught, cease condemnation and forgive. Obviously, not everyone who may appreciate something about the story of Jesus is aware of that specific teaching. And further, not all who are aware of it are equally developed in the practice of forgiveness or humble repentance from condemnation, from contempt toward another group or individual, or even shame and guilt towards one's own past. Shall we condemn those Christians or any other person who is not as developed in forgiveness as we might be? Like, let's take a 6-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 15-year-old. Should we condemn them equally? Should we condemn them in an incremental way? Or should we not condemn them at all? For condemning or anything else? Shall we condemn them for even only a recent history of condemning? Maybe they just did a little condemning. Should I condemn a 6-year-old or a 60-year-old because they condemned me or condemned something else or condemned some institution or some practice? Shall we add to the already long history of religious hypocrisy, of condemning other people for the crime of condemning? We could even simply condemn all people who condemn people, or at least condemn some of the people who condemn people. We could do that. We could also condemn the media for doing what they have always done, even when the media was newspapers or scribes. We could condemn the politicians for doing what they have always done, thousands of years, hundreds of years, decades, and so on. We could condemn any of the traditionalists for resisting alternative theoretical models and conceptual models and linguistic models, like by how those traditionalists may have been condemning those models or punishing people for even mentioning those models openly in public. So we could condemn some or all traditions and traditionalism. We could do that. We could even condemn being respectful of traditions and traditionalism rather than contemptuous. We could make contempt into a new tradition to champion. Contempt is next to godliness, we could shout. We could write it on signs. What we need is more contempt. Okay, maybe I don't need more contempt, but obviously you do. We could condemn contempt and have contempt towards condemnation and say hypocrisy is hypocritical and no one should be a hypocrite. It's actually kind of a funny thing to say. Anyway, who can we trust? On certain currency of the United States, it says, "In God we trust." Who can we trust? If we have matured beyond the stage of reactive condemning, worshipping of tradition, and perhaps then, and only then, we would be worthy of trusting ourselves. Until then, we may be kind of floundering around and looking for saviors, looking for people that we can always trust, rather than being realistic that the person that I trust with my auto repair needs, I might not trust them to, uh, you know, be a babysitter or a dog sitter or whatever. You don't trust anyone for everything. So, intuition has something to do with trusting oneself. Who do I trust? Well, intuition can guide my trusting. It has always, all along anyway. Not that we wouldn't do anything else besides follow intuition. But who can we trust? When there is a context of acceptance and forgiveness, then this question of who can we trust isn't so much an expression of contempt and desperation. It's a real question. Who can we trust? For what? How? Curiosity is there. Who can we trust?